All right, let's talk about poop. Well, we're not really going to talk about poop, but we are going to talk about fertilizer. So to preface this video, we are just going to talk about the absolute generic information you need to get started with fertilizing your houseplants. It can be a little different when it comes to fertilizing outdoor plants, seeing as a lot of outdoor plants require different nutrients or have different requirements when it comes to fertilizing. So we're going to strictly talk about houseplants right now. Now, when you think about fertilizing, ultimately fertilizing has two goals. The first one is to provide nutrients to the plants, which is probably the most common idea about fertilizing. The second is also to enhance the effectiveness of the soil, which means that we could be optimizing how the soil works for the plant in order for the plant to absorb the nutrients. So us as humans, we have a regular diet and we tend to focus on macronutrients, which would be carbs, proteins, and fats. The same goes for plants. They have macro and micronutrients as well. So we're going to focus really just on the macronutrients, which is the nitrogen, the phosphorus, and the potassium. Nitrogen really helps to enhance and affect the leaf growth. So if you happen to have very foliage forward plants, you would want to ensure that your fertilizer has a very high content of nitrogen. Now, the second macronutrient that you may see listed on your fertilizer is phosphorus. Now, phosphorus tends to really enhance the flower growth, seeds, fruit, roots. So if you have a flowering plant, mowage. So if you happen to have a flowering plant or a plant that you're wanting to focus on root growth, or perhaps you're wanting to produce seeds from this plant, you would want to have a very high phosphorus content. Now, the last macronutrient really focuses on the overall absorption that the plant has. It helps to enhance the way that the plant moves water throughout its system. It can help with stem growth and also aid in flowering and fruiting. But if you search, you could probably find a fertilizer that really is potassium dominant if you're wanting to really focus on that. Now, these three macronutrients typically show up on the bottles or packages in numerical form. You will find three numbers separated by dashes. First one being nitrogen, the second one being phosphorus, and the third one being potassium. So if you're looking at a fertilizer where the content is 10, 10, 10, that typically means that you have 10% nitrogen, 10% phosphorus, or 10% potassium. I almost forgot what the third one was. Now, this fertilizer, for example, has a 12-4-8 content. So you have 12% nitrogen, 4% phosphorus, and 8% potassium. Now, it's important to know exactly what it is that you're really trying to feed in your plant. So like I said, if you have a very foliage forward plant where you want a lot of leaf growth, so where it strictly is foliage and you're not expecting any flowers and it already has a healthy root system, you would definitely want to get a fertilizer that has a higher nitrogen count. So knowing what the percentage of the chemical content is in the fertilizer is going to really help you focus in on what you're trying to achieve with your plant growth. Now, generally, when in doubt, usually going with a balanced fertilizer is your safest bet because the plant can absorb and utilize the nutrients as it sees fit. But you do want to be careful that you're not over-fertilizing your plant as well, and we'll get into that a little later in the video. So another basic idea about fertilizers that you may have to consider would be the differences between a synthetic or an organic fertilizer. Now, organic fertilizers are categorized by having a biological origin. What that means is an organic fertilizer would probably be a manure or animal waste of some sort. It could also be decomposing material or some other type of organic medium. Now, synthetic are typically chemical compositions. So they're a mixture of man-made chemicals or synthetic or made to look like real or natural ingredients. Generally, synthetic fertilizers tend to be stronger and more concentrated. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with synthetic fertilizers. A lot of people use them and they can be very helpful if you have to fertilize a lot of area at one time. But the thing to be careful of is because they do tend to be a little bit more concentrated and they are a little stronger, oftentimes you may want to dilute them for a very small houseplant. Especially houseplants that tend to be a little bit more sensitive or a little bit finicky or have very delicate root systems. A lot of the times, synthetic fertilizers also tend to be liquid form, whereas an organic fertilizer can come in different forms. These are two different forms that I have. This one actually comes as a powder that you add water to and then becomes a liquid fertilizer. And then this is a type of waste, this is actually worm castings, which is basically worm poop. Now, organic fertilizers, because they do tend to be more gentle, are probably easier to fertilize your houseplants with because your risk of over-fertilizing is lower. And with organic fertilizers, you might fertilize a little bit more frequently. Now, I mentioned earlier about over-fertilizing your plants, and that is very easy to do when you have very sensitive plants. Because the root systems are very delicate or because the leaves tend to be very thin, it's very easy for too much chemical to get into the plant and cause a reaction where the plant can reject it or have damage to it. So you want to feed very slow and steady and very consistently. Much like when we eat our diets, we would eat several times a day. We would want to feed our plants periodically over time in a very systematic fashion in order for the plant to actually absorb the nutrients that we're feeding it. Now, when you do find a fertilizer that you're going to use, it's very important that you follow the manufacturer's directions. And that's going to enable you to fertilize your plants very safely. Because synthetic fertilizers or liquid fertilizers tend to be extremely concentrated, sometimes you can dilute it even more than the manufacturer's directions if you want to be a little on the safe side. Now, my personal favorites are organic because I don't like to think too much of the mathematics when it comes to how much I should fertilize my plant. So worm castings are really great, or any kind of manure-based fertilizer, because you can mix it in with the soil as you plant your plants. Now that will also help you get a slow release fertilizer over time and to enrich the soil so that you have a better absorption of all of the nutrients as well. Liquid dirt's really great because, like I said, it is a natural and organic fertilizer, which will help for you to steadily feed your plants over time because you add a little bit in with your water every time you water your plants and kind of take some of the guesswork out of it. Now, I do like these other fertilizers because they do tend to be very specific. So I have a well-balanced fertilizer that I can use for some of my larger plants, and then I have a very nutrient-specific fertilizer that I can use if there's something very specific with a very particular plant that I really want to attack, or I want to ensure that I'm feeding it the nutrients I want to give it. As you get into a larger collection, or you might have very different types of plants in your household, you might notice that you're accumulating different types of fertilizers. If you really want to just keep it simple, a well-balanced fertilizer is probably the best thing. The big question is, when do you fertilize your plants? I have two basic rules of thumb when it comes to fertilizing my plants. Some may agree with me, some may not, but I just find these to be very fundamental ideas that help me keep track of when to fertilize my plants. So the first one is that when you should start fertilizing your plant. And generally, I would recommend starting to fertilize your plant 2 to 3 months after you have either bought the plant or repotted the plant. Now, why might that be? Now, if you bought the plant, typically a lot of nurseries or plant stores have already fertilized the plant, or they could come with a slow release fertilizer that might be already in the soil medium. So you don't want to add more fertilizer on top of that, not knowing when they have or have not fertilized it. So giving it a couple months or a small period of time to allow any fertilizer that is already existing in that plant to be used up will make sure that I'm not adding more fertilizer on top of that, and then I can start feeding it in order to ensure that the plant is getting the exact nutrients I want it to get. Now, if I repotted a plant, typically I would add in a lot of worm castings or some other kind of nutrient into the soil when I'm repotting, because I like to mix my own soils. So I already know I put fertilizer in it, and I'm going to give it a couple of months after that to ensure that it's spent all of the nutrients in that soil before I amend it and add even more. And typically you can go start 2 to 3 months after, but you can even wait as long as 6 months after depending on the plant, depending on how long you've had it, how much light it's getting, how often you water it. Obviously, there's a lot of factors that can affect it, so when in doubt, give it a few months and then you can start. Now, frequency of fertilizing a plant can vary as well. Just as I said before, the amount of light, the amount of water, and its environment can affect how fast that plant might be using its nutrients. So generally speaking, if a plant is in a well-lit area and being watered frequently and seems to be showing a lot of active growth, you would want to fertilize the plant. And that goes in with number 2 of my rules of thumb, and that is also to actively fertilize your plant anytime you see new growth. So because every plant has its own lifespan or has its own rate of growth, it's hard to really have a set schedule as to when you should fertilize your plant throughout the year. Now me, living in Southern California, I get sun pretty much 11 months out of the year. Having so much light, I'm going to be having active growth almost all year long. I would probably fertilize my plants all year long. Now, if you're living in a part of the world where you have very heavy winters, lower light, maybe that plant just lives in a darker corner and it's not seeing that much movement or growth. It's not spending that much energy, so you will probably need to fertilize less. As an idea, if I know that plant is showing active growth, I know I should fertilize it. It's spending energy to produce more plant cells, so it probably needs some food in order to do that. Now, a lot of new plant parents might be scared of fertilizing and don't, because it's only going to help get your plants bigger and more beautiful. And if you start with something simple like an organic fertilizer that won't really damage your plants and you can kind of slowly ease into it, then you'll be fine. But if you have any questions, feel free to drop them below. And if you have any suggestions, also leave them too, because I think it's really helpful when we all help each other out. But I hope I helped. I hope this was useful information and gave you some ideas. And I will see you guys next time. Thanks. Bye.